Okay. Well, we should start. Welcome to the second morning session of the workshop, The Place of Inconsistent Science in Scientific Pluralism. Now, Dunja Šešelja, from the Institute for Philosophy of the Ruhr University Bochum, is going to talk, or more properly answer, how much should scientific pluralists care about inconsistency, by offering or specifying different types of inconsistent toleration based on cognitive attitudes and the position of inconsistent theories or specific domains, right?
Yes.
Well, you have 50 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. You can let me know when I am.
Yes, I will let you know.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, is okay? Okay.
How are we with time in general? Or maybe I will ask you at some point how much.
Yes, I will let you know.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in Mexico. So, Luis and Maria, she disappeared?
Yeah.
Okay.
She will be back.
Okay. So in this talk, I would like to focus mainly on philosophy of science and concrete accounts of scientific pluralism. So here's the problem which I would like to tackle. Pluralists have talked about inconsistency toleration mainly implicitly, and certain problems have come out of these discussions. But it's been hard for pluralists to address these problems, or at least they have been somewhat avoiding them, being vague about them. And what I would like to do in this talk is go into these problems and really specify what kind of inconsistency toleration is required by scientific pluralists, and in which kinds of scientific pluralism this kind of inconsistency toleration would be important. So here is the structure of my talk. I will make a short introduction, and then I will present the account of, or an umbrella term for what is usually called in the literature modest pluralism. Then I will present the account of radical pluralism. And in each of these, I will talk about the types of inconsistency tolerations that are relevant for these frameworks. And finally, I will speak a bit about different perspectives on inconsistency analysis, which will, we will come to that, but which will show us that whether we identify inconsistencies or not really depends on the type of, on the body of the propositions we are focusing on. So, first the introduction. I would like to start by distinguishing between different levels of inconsistency analysis. So first of all, we have a historical descriptive level, where we ask the questions, do inconsistencies commonly appear in science, or do scientists sometimes accept reasons from inconsistencies? And here we have, for instance, the work of Dieter Wickers has here been quite relevant. Then we have a logical normative level, where we ask the question, can we rationally reason from an inconsistent set of premises without ending up in a logical explosion? And this has also been largely addressed by the talks in this section. And finally, we have a methodological normative level, where we ask the question, what is the role of the standard of consistency in evaluations which take part in scientific inquiries? And this is what I would like to focus on this methodological perspective. Now, when we speak of the methodological standard of consistency, we all know of the work of Karl Popper, who has famously brought the standard claiming that internal inconsistency is a necessary condition which every scientific theory has to satisfy, and inconsistent theories simply have to be rejected. Why? Because of the obvious fact that the self-contradictory system must be rejected because it is false. So this is a quote which has often been repeated in the discussions on inconsistencies. But this kind of view has persisted up to recently. For instance, Heather Douglas, in her paper, has argued that internal inconsistency is an epistemic criterion which needs to be satisfied if a given scientific theory is to be accepted. So in this discussion, Douglas calls again upon the ex contradictione quod libet, arguing that if you accept inconsistencies, then you accept anything. Nevertheless, in the post-Kuhnian philosophy of science, there has been a bit more caution in this regard, and many have argued that inconsistencies, first of all, commonly appear in science, and that scientists, as rational agents, may sometimes accept, in a certain sense of the term, and reason from inconsistencies. And that this methodological requirement of consistency needs to be weakened, and this has been argued by Feyerabend, Lakatos, Nichols, etc. Moreover, this issue of inter-theoretical inconsistencies, so consistency or inconsistency between theories, has been raised in the recent literature on scientific pluralism as well. So now we come to the topic of scientific pluralism, and first of all, I would like to specify what I mean by scientific pluralism. In general terms, scientific pluralism would be a normative stance according to which a parallel existence of multiple mutually incompatible research programs within a certain scientific domain is considered epistemically and methodologically beneficial. So it's not only that we have a plurality of theories, but this plurality is something good in epistemic and methodological sense of the term. And we have a number of philosophers of science being proponents of this kind of approach, from Feyerabend over Rascher, more recently Hasok Chang, Helen Longino, etc. So these are all authors who have been arguing for this methodological sense of pluralism. Now, we have had certain comments by pluralists on inconsistency toleration. Rascher has written, life being what it is, the community, referring to scientific community, as a whole is bound to adopt inconsistent views. Then Helen Longino writes, I countenance the possibility of different, equally defensible background assumptions, facilitating inferences to quite different and irreconcilable, even non-mutually consistent representations of what is pre-theoretically identified as the same phenomenon. And Hasok Chang has also written, while writing on epistemic or cognitive values, he has argued that there is no absolute reason why even logical consistency should be placed above empirical adequacy. So sometimes we might end up with inconsistencies, but this is no big deal. It's no problem. However, this inconsistency toleration has brought pluralists to some kind of trouble. What kind of trouble? Well, in some recent discussions, and I don't want to go into details of these discussions because they are not so important for the purpose of my talk, but what is important is that this has been taken as an argument against the epistemic value of pluralism. So Karen Friedman has made a critical analysis of Longino's account, and then she writes in this quote that Longino's account leads us to inconsistent, even contradictory representations or conformations. This is technical word from Longino, it doesn't matter now, of the world. And because of that, there is some problem in her account, because while diversity in our communities of scientific inquiries is valuable, it is not because it can be counted for improving our knowledge. So what Friedman argues is that because Longino's account allows for inconsistent views, we can't take it to be something which improves our knowledge. So there is some problem here with that. The main idea behind this argument, which Friedman brings, is that inconsistency toleration is epistemically harmful. So basic idea is Longino's got a problem because she allows for inconsistent views. And there has been a reply in the forthcoming paper by Jill Fallows to this Friedman's objection to Longino, and Fallows argues, well, Longino doesn't really allow for inconsistencies, she allows for incompatibilities. I will come later in my talk to this distinction between inconsistencies and incompatibilities, but once again, the assumption is that we don't want to allow for inconsistencies. So this is the main message of this discussion. All right, so in this talk, what I would like to do is to show in which sense inconsistency toleration can be, is important for pluralists, and to specify the borders of this inconsistency toleration. So when should we really get worried, or when can't we really tolerate inconsistencies? I will use a certain framework of analysis. First of all, I will distinguish different types of pluralism, namely modest and a radical one, and I will specify different cognitive attitudes in which we can tolerate inconsistency, and I will distinguish for each of these pluralism with regards to which kind of cognitive attitudes or which kind of evaluations we can speak of inconsistency toleration. And finally, I will use this specific way of locating inconsistencies by distinguishing between the inconsistencies which appear in the commitments of scientists in contrast to the inconsistencies which we identify while we look at the scientific domain from a meta perspective, then between inconsistencies within a theory or between theories, and we can also distinguish inconsistencies between theoretical and their observational terms. So these are common distinctions in the literature, except for this first one. This will come in the end of my talk, but they are very important if you want to really specify what we mean by inconsistency toleration. So let me go to the conceptions of modest pluralism. Let's begin from monism. In order to specify what at all is modest pluralism, it's very useful to first take an account, a very, very concrete account of what the monist picture in philosophy of science amounts to. And I take here a definition provided by Keller, Longino, and Waters, where they give us certain points which would be argued for by monists. An interesting question is whether there are any monists out there. So we have often argued against monism, but I've never met a philosopher of science who actually is a monist because it's a very hard view to defend. But still, it's methodologically useful to have this specified concretely. The phrases in blue are my terms, so I just try to summarize what each of these points are. So first of all, we have what I call axiological assumption, namely that the ultimate aim of science is to establish a single, complete, and comprehensive account of the natural world, or the part of the world investigated by the science, based on a single set of fundamental principles. So this tells us something about what are we coming to, what is at the end of the science. We want one picture of the world. Second, we have a metaphysical assumption that the nature of the world is such that it can, at least in principle, be completely described or explained by such an account. So the world is such that we can grasp it in this monist way. Third, we have a methodological assumption that there exists, at least in principle, methods of inquiry that, if correctly pursued, will yield such an account. So somehow we might manage to get there with certain method. And then certain assumptions regarding evaluation. First of all, evaluative methodological assumption that methods of inquiry are to be accepted on the basis whether they can yield such an account. So if a method seems to lead us to the different accounts, then something's wrong with it. And evaluative theoretical assumption that individual theories and models in science are to be evaluated in large part on the basis of whether they provide or come close to providing a comprehensive and complete account based on fundamental principles. So these would be 5 core assumptions of a monist view. So now, what is the stance of modest pluralism? Typically, modest pluralists adopt points 1 to 3 or 1 and 2 at least, but they reject the 4 and 5, sometimes also 3. So once again, they agree that in principle we want to get a unified picture of science, that the world is such that we can grasp it. Whether there is a method, okay, some modest pluralists say yes, some would say no, we don't know, but they definitely don't want to go this path. They don't want to say that we should now evaluate our current methods on the basis of whether they lead us here, because we are just so far from here that it doesn't matter. And the same goes for theories. Whether our theories are unified or not doesn't tell us anything about whether they are good enough. So for a modest pluralist, plurality is only a means to an end, because the main motivation is that scientific reasoning is uncertain and defeasible, and we have we are getting there by revising our conceptions. We have multiple conceptions. We don't know which of them are going to be true or accurate, so we need this plurality in order to, at the end of the day, come to some unified picture of the world. Most prominently, Philip Kitcher has argued for this modest account for pluralism, and according to him, there may be different theories about one and the same phenomenon, since different classificatory systems reflect different cognitive interests. However, accepted theories should be mutually translatable, ideal. They should be mutually translatable, and a single theoretical account can, in principle, accommodate all explanatory interests. For Kitcher, this is, again, in the first and second point, this is something which we want to reach, but it's not something which we have now. So methodologically, it's hard to say that Kitcher would really differ from some more radical approaches to pluralism, which give up on these assumptions. But at the end of the day, this is something which we want to strive to. There are some other modern scientific pluralists. I'm not going to read all these quotes, but I put them here in order to show that they are very insistent on the standard of consistency. So here is Martin Carrier, who has an idea of pluralism combined with striving for consensus so that we reach objectivity. And he mentions in one of the papers that the two uncontested standards of evaluation of theories are empirical adequacy and consistency. Similarly, Sandra Mitchell writes that minimally we expect representations to be consistent with each other. So these are quite strong claims from modest pluralists. So what about inconsistency toleration? Do modest pluralists allow, or do they need, or should they need, allow for some kind of inconsistency toleration? So first of all, I would like to go into the evaluation of pursuit-worthiness of scientific theories, because this is the place where I think modest pluralists not only should allow, but they actually require inconsistency toleration. So when we speak of the notion of pursuit-worthiness, it concerns the evaluation of young or the unsettled research program. So we ask whether this research program is still worthy of further investigation, rather than whether it is worthy of acceptance. And so, in contrast to monism, the presence of mutually inconsistent research programs is not a problem for modest pluralists, because we are not at the end of the science, and it doesn't need an immediate solution. So modest pluralism is compatible with the toleration of both internal and external inconsistencies at this level, and such toleration is actually important for the pluralist goals, because if we have research programs which are mutually inconsistent, but we don't know which of them is better, and we want to strive towards a unified picture of the world, then we shouldn't discard prematurely one of these two accounts. However, we need also some standards. We cannot just say, well, they are inconsistent, it doesn't matter, anything goes, so we just allow for variety. We need some kind of what pluralists call conservationist pluralism. This is Hassab Chang's term. So it's a restricted pluralism because it doesn't allow just for anything to come in. A nice example of this kind of inconsistency toleration is Wegener's theory of continental drift, which was an account which appeared in the beginning of the 20th century, and it appeared as one of the three rivaling accounts at the time. So the question was still unsettled whether the continents were once forming one big continent and then they drifted apart, or whether they were always apart. The alternative, so Wegener suggested the theory of continental drift. According to this, indeed happened. But the other two accounts were the so-called contractionism, according to which Earth is like a drying apple, and over the time it has cooled down and contracted, and these mountains and other phenomena have, like an apple which is drying, they're just popping up because the formations are changing from the contraction. And the third account, permanentism, stipulated that nothing changed. Everything is like it's always been, and they had their own explanations of the geological phenomena conforming to this. So now, Wegener's theory of continental drift was highly explanatory, especially of the similarity between flora and fauna of the opposite side of the oceans. It had really wonderful explanations for this. However, the main problem was the mechanism of drift. So the claim that continents can move through the solid ocean floor was inconsistent with the evidence that the inside of the Earth is actually solid. So they were thinking, how can this hard rock just go through hard rock? Just doesn't make any sense. And so Rachel Adam puts this nicely. The problem with drift was not simply that there was no known mechanism or cause, but that any conceivable mechanism would conflict with physical theory. Now, what was Wegener's reply? Wegener had certain hypotheses to respond to this attack. First of all, he said that Earth's materials may behave in a rigid manner in response to term duration disturbances such as seismic waves. So if we look at seismic waves, we get information that the Earth is solid because otherwise the seismic waves would not go through. But the same materials may exhibit plasticity in response to small, steady, and slow pressure over geological time. So it's like a bit similar if you think of wax. It's hard, but if you press it long enough, it will deform. So the substrate, according to Wegener, may behave over geological time in a fluid manner. At this point, he didn't have any evidence for this. This was just a hypothesis to help his account get somehow find some response to this inconsistency. Moreover, Wegener's response was not entirely ad hoc. It was compatible with the theory of isostasy, which concerns the condition to which crust and the mantle tend in the absence of disturbing forces. So in the second half of the 19th century, the question was, how is this crust, the upper layer of the Earth, how are they immersed in the lower layer of the Earth? And the hypothesis which came with this theory about isostasy was that the crust is like the icebergs. You can conceive of them as icebergs floating in the sea. And so the sea, it has different density, the inner layers have different density. So if this substrate has some level of plasticity, then the continents can somehow push through it. And this theory of isostasy was not something Wegener invented, it was argued by other authors. So there was a coherence between Wegener's methodological response and these accounts. Thanks. Okay, so methodological response which Wegener provided to inconsistency showed that further examination of the substrate was needed to confirm the relation between drift and seismology, and that the conflict between the two was not at all inevitable. So he recognized that there is a problem, but he also found a certain methodological solution for this problem, at least temporarily, to show, well, it's not really necessarily a problem, we might find a solution. This leads us to a more general point regarding what kind of solution scientists can provide once they recognize an inconsistency. And this is often in literature called the programmatic character. So a theory should have a set of theoretical and methodological solutions for proceeding further in spite of current problems, anomalies such as inconsistency. So we recognize an inconsistency in a pursued theory. We say, okay, this is something problematic, but then if we find a certain way to say, okay, this is not necessarily problematic because we have ways of proceeding further and tackling this problem, or certain other values outweigh this one anomaly, then there is no reason to discard this theory. It still may very well be fruitful. So,
sorry, I missed what was the inconsistency between the Wegener's theory?
The Wegener's theory and was inconsistent with the assumption that the Earth is hard, and so
Jeffrey's objection.
But Jeffrey belonged to the contractionist camp. So he was one of the proponents of the, but it was more inconsistent with the seismology. So the theory, the inconsistency was larger than just between Ryland research programs. Mm-hmm. So that's why Rachel Loudon writes that the inconsistency was between Wegener's theory and the physical theory. So the how we can physically conceive of the inside of the Earth. And so it was a bit stronger than if you get just multiple research programs which are mutually inconsistent. But indeed, there was an inconsistency also between the drift theory and the contractionism and permanentism. So we also have external inconsistency between all these three research programs. Okay, now I have another example which concerns the inconsistencies between theories and a theory and observation. And this is usually this kind of inconsistencies are simply in literature conceived of as explanatory anomalies. So we have a theory predicting that something is the case. Observationally, we get something else is the case, and now we have an anomaly. How should we explain this problem? The question here is, should this kind of inconsistency affect our assessment of perceived worthiness? We are still in the conception of modest pluralism, which is a very weak stance, but most philosophers of science hold this one. And this is a nice example, the bacterial hypothesis of peptic ulcer disease. So there were, regarding the peptic ulcer disease, there were two hypotheses existing from the late 19th century until the mid-20th century, namely the bacterial hypothesis, according to which bacteria cause the ulcer in the stomach. This is a kind of wound in the stomach. Nowadays we know that there is a bacteria, Helicobacter, which causes it. But back then they didn't know what causes it. So the one hypothesis was there are bacteria which cause the peptic ulcer, and another hypothesis was acidity in the stomach causes kind of corrosion of the stomach and causes this ulcer. Now, in 1954, there was a large-scale study by Ed Palmer showing that there are no bacteria in the stomach. So Palmer examined over 1,000 bodies, looked at the tissues, found no bacteria whatsoever. And this result was inconsistent with the basic premise of the bacterial research program, namely that the bacteria indeed survive in the human stomach. This was the assumption. That's why we look for them as possible factors which could cause the illness. Now, in a paper which Christian and I have wrote, we argued that the bacterial hypothesis was still worthy of pursuit in spite of this anomaly. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the main idea here is that scientists had ways of challenging Palmer's results at the time at the methodological level. The reason is it's a really fascinating story. Palmer used a wrong method of staining. Staining is a kind of coloring of the tissue, which you use to identify bacteria. And Palmer used a method which was 14 years before him in a paper which he himself cites, argued to be a wrong method to use for this purpose. So in 1940, two scientists, Friedberg and Baron, said, we examined the stomach tissue. They made a similar study, just much smaller. They examined 30 bodies. I'm not sure, no, these were live patients, sorry. And they found out some bacteria, but the results were inconclusive, but they write a nice warning at the end of the paper. In our experience, it was impossible to detect bacteria with this one staining technique. We had to use the other one. Palmer cites this paper just as one of the references in his paper, but totally ignores this issue and uses the staining method, which these guys argues is not very reliable. So at the time, of course, it's easy for us nowadays to say why Palmer was wrong, but the interesting thing is that at the time, scientists had ways of challenging his results, maybe by saying, okay, let's see if there really are no bacteria, because you use this one staining technique and we have to replicate the study or at least keep the question open. So once again, from the perspective of modest pluralism, consistency, internal, external, or between a theory and observation, is not a necessary requirement for the pursuit worthiness, where it is important to keep in mind that the magnitude of the problem that an inconsistency creates depends on the presence of a methodological response. So do scientists have ways of proceeding further despite of this anomaly? Sometimes this anomaly will be extremely large. Just think of some pseudo-scientific theory, such as some pseudo-scientific theory in medicine, which claims something which is so inconsistent on so many levels that they have no programmatic character whatsoever to respond to this problem. Then we want to uphold the standards of external consistency. But if the scientists have ways of proceeding further and answering why it makes sense for them to proceed further, then from the perspective of modest pluralism, it's perfectly fine to keep these accounts because, once again, modest pluralists want to get at the end of the day at one true picture of the world, so there is no reason to discard these theories while we are still working on them. All right. One more thing about modest pluralism. If you look at the main domain where inconsistencies appear, as long as this domain does not have a consensus on a unifying theoretical account, neither of the theories can be ratified as acceptable, but rather as a work in progress. So modest pluralists are not ready to commit to inconsistency toleration at the level of theory acceptance. So we can have inconsistency toleration at the level of pursuit theories, but once we accept them, they shouldn't be inconsistent. Okay, so now we go to a next step. This is a bit stronger version of pluralism, which is usually called in the literature radical pluralism. A nice way to show this difference between modest and radical pluralism is by discussion between Kitcher and Longino. So Philip Kitcher and Helen Longino have had a dispute over pluralism and their commitments regarding it. And Kitcher has built his notion of pluralism as motivated by incompleteness rather than inconsistencies. So different accounts are incomplete because we just don't know everything about the nature, but we don't want them to be mutually inconsistent if we accept these theories. Here is what Kitcher writes about Longino. In advocating pluralism, Longino goes beyond the modest view to the suggestion that the representations we achieve may not be congruent, may resist reconciliation, or may be non-reconcilable. Although she seems to be a fan of the principle of non-contradiction, as I think she should be, she wants to allow for the acceptability of representations that are hard to reconcile. And this is something Kitcher is not ready to accept. So he says, it's not, when we speak of accepted theories, it's not just that she wants incomplete accounts. He gives an example of different maps of the world. So just think of different maps that display in different ways the Earth, but we wouldn't say that they are mutually inconsistent. They are just different. They are incomplete. Each of them is incomplete. And this is what Kitcher is completely fine with, that we have different accounts which are incomplete. But we don't want them to be really conflicting with each other, then we shouldn't accept them. So here Kitcher brings Bohr's model of atom, and he said if we have inconsistencies in this kind of approaches, then this is just a spur to further research. We don't accept these accounts. Scientists want to amend one or both of the conflicting representations, so to arrive at a consistent account of the area of overlap. So what we learn from this discussion between Kitcher and Longino is that in contrast to modest pluralism, radical pluralism, as it is presented in the literature, rejects all those points of monism. So recall, there was an axiological assumption, where we want to get at the end of the day with science, metaphysical assumption, what is the world like, whether the world allows us to get to this, methodological assumption, whether we have methods for this, and radical pluralists just say, for this stuff, we just don't know, we suspend the judgment of this. Whether the world decides to allow us one single account, who knows? We just thought this goes beyond our empirical inquiry. Whether we can ever achieve, whether this is a warranted aim of science, it's also not clear. Maybe we are better off with the plurality of theories. So Longino is ready to say, maybe we will have different accounts, and at the end of the day, they might also be non-reconcilable. We will get to the question whether she's committed to making them really inconsistent, because she's awfully unclear on this. And in the 2002 discussion with Kitcher, she was using really the term inconsistency, but from 2006 on, she more moved towards the term incompatibility. So this is what I will come later on, because it's quite hard to argue for the acceptance of mutually inconsistent theories in the same domain, but we'll get there. Here are some quotes from Longino, where this is still this time 2002, where she was inconsistency friendly, so to say, or at least she was using this terminology. So here she said, this is the quote which I read in the beginning, that she is fine with mutually inconsistent representations of a pre-theoretically, what is pre-theoretically identified as the same phenomenon. And here she argues that the demand of consistency is only problematic if we allow for detachment of propositions from the context in which they emerge. So Longino argues we have different theoretical accounts and they build different contexts. These are different contextual frameworks. So we can't just pull proposition from one account, another proposition from another account, and now try to argue for their consistency, because they are just belonging to different conceptual frameworks. So what Longino argues, I think, is pretty much in line with what Rascher wrote, that we want to allow for weak inconsistency, namely we accept P in one framework and we accept non-P in another one, but we don't want to allow for the acceptance of P and non-P in one and the same domain. These are just some ideas from Rascher, that tolerating weak inconsistency may be fruitful, and it does not imply anything goes, and that local inconsistency is crucial, but local consistency is crucial, but more globally, with the discipline as a whole, inconsistency should be tolerated. I think this is a bit unqualified, because as I've argued before, if an inconsistency is not really posing a big problem, especially at the level of pursuit theories, there is no big deal with it. But let's say that if you speak just at the level of acceptance, this is what Longino would probably go with. But just one more quote from Longino. For her, a scientific domain may consist of overlapping systems, each meeting its own or a common standard of adequacy, but giving accounts of common classes that are not consistent with each other. So she really here, as you can see, argues that we don't necessarily need accounts which are mutually consistent with each other. So it seems from here that Longino does go into some level of inconsistency toleration at the level of acceptance. But it is not clear really what kind of acceptance she means, what kind of acceptance this is. So what I would like to do now is go into two different notions of acceptance and look whether we can allow for inconsistency toleration and what are the borders of what are the limits of this kind of inconsistency toleration. So I will now intentionally start from a very strong notion of acceptance. This is the strongest epistemic notion I know, which is used by philosophers of science, but it is not at all as strong as epistemologists would use it. So if epistemologists would to see the notion of knowledge, as I mentioned it here, they wouldn't be very happy with it because it's much weaker than what epistemologists would like to look at. But for philosophers of science, this is perfectly fine. So this is Hugh Lacey's notion of acceptance, according to which a soundly accepted theory of a specified domain of phenomena is a theory of which it is confirmed that it manifests cognitive values highly. Cognitive values would be explanatory power, predictive power, consistency also, with respect to an appropriate array of empirical data gained from observing these phenomena. The main idea is the following. The research has settled because we have confirmed the theory so much that there is nothing else to do there, and the criticism is exhausted, which means that there are no fruitful research avenues that could undermine the results, or at least we don't see any now. So just think of a hypothesis that viruses and bacteria cause illnesses. We don't know how to, this hypothesis alone, that microorganisms can cause illnesses, it was a big deal in the late 19th century medicine, but nowadays we just don't know how to question this. We will have to bring hypotheses of us being in a matrix or something like that to question this hypothesis. Similarly, if you think of this case of Helicobacter, which has been discovered in the 1980s, and there was a lot of evidence for it that Helicobacter causes peptic ulcer, this hypothesis is so entrenched that we just don't know how to question this. There are cases of people getting peptic ulcer without Helicobacter, but that's a different thing. The main claim is that in many cases, Helicobacter is a major cause of peptic ulcers, and this hypothesis is very entrenched. So we don't have clear, fruitful ways of challenging it. Okay, so now if we think of inconsistency toleration, I think the key question here, whether inconsistency should be tolerated at the level of accepted theories in this sense, is the following. We have to ask the question, does the inconsistency with another pursued worthy or accepted theory allow for new fruitful lines of inquiry that could possibly undermine the current theory? So Ottavio mentioned, for instance, inconsistency between theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. It's not clear whether this inconsistency is really causing any ways to challenge each of these theories further, so that this inconsistency could possibly undermine them. If it would, then these theories, according to this definition, neither of them would be acceptable in this way. If we were to say that this inconsistency is just at the fringes of both theories and it's not a real trouble to undermine the core ideas of both theories, then these theories are acceptable in spite of this inconsistency, and we have at place inconsistency toleration at the level of accepted theories. So I think the difference between acceptance in a strong sense and acceptance in a weaker sense depends on what inconsistency does to the between these theories.
Just one quick comment. Lacey relativized the definition to a certain domain, and that's how you can get away with the problem. So one is the domain of the very large, the other is very small.
Yeah, true. If you say that each of these theories is accepted in a different domain of phenomena, the only question is whether this external inconsistency would pose then a trouble for each of them in this domain of phenomena.
As I said, that's only if you need to do something when you...
If you agree that they would be applicable to this domain of phenomena, yes. Okay, but there is another notion of acceptance which I would like here to bring up. So there is an acceptance in a pragmatic sense, which is, Lacey calls this notion endorsement. So the idea is that you accept a certain theory because you have enough evidence for it, and you find it sufficiently confirmed to apply it to a certain domain of phenomena. So just think of the hypothesis that a certain chemical substance is toxic. We are collecting evidence. Maybe we don't have a final answer to this, but we just want, because of precautionary reasons, we say, okay, we endorse the hypothesis that this substance is toxic in view of the current evidence. Maybe in 1 year we will change our mind. It's not like we would accept the theory in a full-blown sense because okay, this is not just a hypothesis, but we are just endorsing it. It's a very pragmatic term, which is why we have to ask the question, how much evidence is enough to accept some hypothesis? And this question we are answering in view of possible consequences of error. What does that mean? That means that we have to ask what will happen if we accept this and we turn out to be wrong. So we accept the hypothesis that certain substances harmless, and then a bunch of people die. Well, possible consequences of error are awful, so we are maybe we shouldn't do that. So the idea is here that the idea is that the non-epistemic values play a large role in this, play a really important role in this notion of acceptance. So we are accepting something, but not just on the basis of epistemic values, but also on the basis of non-epistemic, such as ethical values. To which extent either type of inconsistency can be tolerated here now depends also on these non-epistemic values. So, for instance, in the case of hormone replacement therapy, which has been practiced for menopausal women for many decades, there have been some inconsistent information coming in 2002 in the study initiated by Women's Health Initiative, and due to this inconsistent information, they concluded, well, this hormone replacement therapy is just too risky, so we shouldn't endorse it anymore. So inconsistencies led to the suspendence of judgment on the endorsement of the hypothesis, actually to the, they were not endorsing it anymore because of these inconsistencies. So if inconsistency could pose some concerns regarding possible consequences of error, then of course we don't want to tolerate this inconsistency, we just go away from this theory. Okay, now regarding there is a very nice example by Hasok Chang regarding the application of theories and possible inconsistent accounts. He doesn't really in this quote say that these different accounts are inconsistent. I will just read the quote. So it concerns the GPS system. And Hasok writes that GPS is it works by means of satellites, which are kept in place by Newtonian physics, and atomic clocks ruled by quantum mechanics and corrected by special and general relativity. And this system maps the spherical surface of the round Earth on a geocentric grid or rather geostatic grid, and gives advice to people on the ground from a flat Earth point of view. And he's using this example as a nice way of showing how different incompatible, mutually incompatible, maybe even inconsistent approaches, is an open question, can form a very good way of, can be used all together and applied in practice. But this brings me to the question, what are we really talking about here? Are we talking about inconsistency or incompatibility? And this question has been also raised in more recent literature on scientific pluralism, because scientific pluralists have actually switched to the term incompatibility. The main idea here is that different approaches to problem solutions allow for different conceptual frameworks, which makes inconsistency identification very difficult. So if we have different conceptual frameworks where one and the same term is used in different ways, then to say that they are mutually inconsistent gets tricky. So I will give now an example. Longino has this example of mutually incompatible studies of behavior. So there have been a number of different approaches to the study of behavior, such as aggression and sexual orientation. And Longino says, everybody says that both nature and nurture contribute to or cause behavior, but most seem also to believe that only their approaches successfully articulates the nature of the interaction and hence produces genuine knowledge. So we have here a plurality of different accounts of how should we understand aggression or sexual behavior. What are these accounts? According to quantitative behavior genetics, behavior is largely dependent on hereditary genes. According to social environmental approaches, context and environmental factors are the main play the main role here. And according to developmental system theory, we have to look at a whole set of interdependent factors aimed at understanding the metrics in which any behavior develops. So these are quite different approaches because they are looking at different possible causes of one and the same phenomenon. Geneticists now in their methods focus on groups, environmentalists focus on individuals, and developmentalists treat causal factors in a complex, mutually dependent way. So for instance, where the conflicts emerge is that geneticists look at the study of, they try to study identical twins who are raised separately, and then they look what are the same features, and then they conclude, well, if they have quite similar features, then this is a genetic issue. But environmentalists object to this because they think that the geneticists have inadequate understanding of what counts as sufficiently dissimilar environment, so the environments in which this thing grew up, because they think that also uterine environments should be taken into account, and this is something which they shared. So there is disagreement on their methods. So at the general level of examination, all these different accounts ask the same question: what causes behavior? But they have different way of specifying this question. So what do they mean by behavior at all? Is this a tendency in a population? Are these episodes in the history of an individual? Are these dispositions to respond to situations in one way rather than another? So they are qualifying these questions quite differently. And so Longino says, in spite of the charges and counter-charges, which she lists in her discussion, the research methodologies of each group are not relevant to the questions the other is asking. As research approach refines its questions and its methods for answering those questions, it constructs a domain those methods are fit to explore. So what we have here are multiple different approaches where they start from one and the same phenomenon, what she calls pre-analytic notion of behavior, and now they qualify it in different ways. So now if we say, what causes behavior? Well, here we have environment causes behavior, or its main factor for behavior, or genes are the main factor. It seems we get an inconsistency. But Longino says it's not really. She doesn't have an explicit discussion on this. It's more this now interpretation, which is happening in discussions on Longino's work. But if you take into account that they are defining behavior differently, then it's not really they're talking just about different things. And this is also why pluralists argue all these different accounts are useful because they are addressing different questions. So we don't have really inconsistency. We have incompatibility at the level of how they understand behavior and whether they, for instance, if they argue that their understanding of behavior is the only right one, then we might get tensions between these accounts. But also the question is, if all of them were to agree, okay, we are really doing totally different things, which are all mutually compatible, then we also get rid of the tension. So this is really an open question, which we have to look at each case and see how scientists, what exactly are the reasons for their tensions and the disagreements, etc.
Yeah, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, great. I am exactly finishing. Okay, so we have mutually We have mutually incompatible approaches, but they are not necessarily mutually inconsistent, and inconsistencies appear only if we grant that scientists refer to the same pre-analytic phenomenon. So only if we thought, if we agreed, or if somebody were to argue that all of these approaches talk about the very same phenomenon, then we might get some inconsistencies or incompatibilities in a more stronger sense. Okay, just to now sum up before I go to the final concluding point. So what I have tried to show is that inconsistency toleration seems to be more important for radical pluralists than for modest pluralists. Modest pluralists argue for inconsistency toleration only at the level of pursuit theories. Radical pluralists want something more, but it is not really clear how far they are willing to go. I have shown that I have tried to show that inconsistency toleration at the level of accepted theory is fine as long as we don't have situations where this inconsistency challenges any of the accepted theories in a way that they would not be any more accepted. So they have to be, they may very well be still worthy of pursuit, just not accepted in a strong sense. And I have argued that when it comes to endorsements or pragmatic notion of acceptance, we have to be very cautious what kind of implications we can have from this inconsistency. Pluralists themselves are not clear on these issues, and it seems that incompatibility is something which they are rather willing to talk about than inconsistency, in addition to what I have said. Okay, so just one more thing. This is now a methodological point on how we analyze inconsistencies. So from these cases which I have been presenting, we can analyze inconsistencies from the perspective of practitioners as scientists, where the unit of analysis will be Peter Ricker's notion of pointed groups of propositions. So if we ask the question whether any individual scientist or group of scientists was committed to certain inconsistencies, then we are at this level of analysis. But I just want to point out here, this is not the only level of analysis, because we can also analyze a scientific domain from a meta perspective, where we are looking at the claims constituting the domain. And something is lost if we say this is the only valid framework of analysis, because we want also to see which kind of claims are present in the scientific community at the time. So just think of this Wegener example. If you look at Wegener's own commitments, he was not committed to any inconsistency. He had a very nice explanation for why his theory is not necessarily inconsistent with the physical theory. But from a external perspective, and we say, well, Wegener's theory was inconsistent with something else, this is a valuable insight to detect the problem in the domain, especially if we do history and philosophy of science. When it comes to what these examples show is that when it comes to individual scientists, they have certain strategies of inconsistency avoidance. So first, when it comes to internal inconsistency, scientists can reach to conceptual change. For instance, the conceptual change of the set theory after the discovery of Russell's paradox. Or, for instance, for external inconsistency, scientists can further specify one of the theories in order to reconcile it with another. This was Wegener's response, so he had some methodological response to this. Or if you think of inconsistency between theory or observation, then evidence can be reinterpreted in the way that is consistent with the theory. Here I have some example, but I will not now go into it. But the idea is that you get certain evidence and you say, well, maybe it doesn't mean that, it means something else. And you kind of reinterpret it so that it's that you get rid of the inconsistency. Okay, this was just the example. We can go into it. But the main idea of example is that inconsistency was avoided by explaining away the evidence in a way that was consistent with the dominant theory. We can leave it for discussion if there is time. So what do we learn from these examples is that scientists often reach for heuristic solutions for dealing with claims that threaten to cause inconsistency, and in this way they avoid them. What is important to keep in mind is that if we want to speak of inconsistency toleration in the reasoning of practitioners, we are at this level, we might not find that many inconsistencies because scientists will have the strategies for avoiding them. But if we want to speak of inconsistency toleration at the level of theory evaluation, then we are taking this meta perspective where we ask what is the status of this theory in the current domain given all the claims which constitute its domain. And for this matter of theory evaluation, we can't just look at the commitments of scientists. We need a different perspective. Okay. Just a conclusion. So what I have argued here is that modest pluralism requires inconsistency toleration at the level of pursued theories. Radical pluralism requires inconsistency toleration at the level of acceptance in a certain qualified sense, because we have to take into account that sometimes we may be dealing with incompatibilities rather than inconsistencies. And the inconsistency toleration is relevant at the meta level of theory evaluation rather than at the level of scientist commitments. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dunja. Start here.
Dunja, thanks for it. Was very clear. I have a small informative question,
okay,
and I will keep it there for the first round. The notion of incompatible theories is very important, but I really didn't get it.
Okay.
Because I'm one of these simplistic people who think that two theories are compatible. If you put them together, you have inconsistency.
Yeah.
And you clearly meant something else.
Yes, because if you think of this example of behavior, studies of behavior, if one approach means, let me go back to this slide. I had exactly the same question when I first time heard the talk about this stuff, and then so it was a talk about incompatibilities. Here. And I asked, wait a moment, if we have incompatibilities here, don't we need at some level at least inconsistency? But if these different approaches, we define behavior in different ways. So one approach defines behavior tendency in a population, and another approach focuses on individual. Then I'm not sure that we get inconsistencies anywhere.
But
do you think
why are they incompatible? They talk about different domains in a sense, or about different phenomena.
Yeah, they talk about different phenomena, but they have a tension regarding what is the right specification of this phenomenon. So they do argue with each other. I think the incompatibilities here largely a result of how scientists argue for their theories. So maybe from the perspective of a pluralist philosopher of science analyzing this thing, there are no incompatibilities at all, actually, because they're all doing different things and there is no tension. But it seems this notion of incompatibility reflects the tension which is present in the community of scientists and their commitments. So I agree with you that it's very hard at the meta level to specify that this notion of incompatibility is not necessarily just an epistemic notion. It reflects certain. It's not just an epistemic notion of analysis, but it's more also a notion which shows us something about how these scientists understand their theories.
I wonder, just a tiny question, if when you are talking about incompatibility, it seems that maybe 2 or 3 theories can reinforce in a very soft way the others. Mm-hmm. So you kind of combine them, mm-hmm. but just tiny parts of them, or you get mm-hmm. more information if you relate them. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that you actually are trying to make a new theory or that you believe that you can make a new theory that mm-hmm. includes both of them. So maybe that could be. And that's something that you don't get if you are considering only inconsistency. If you're trying to think about incompatibility as something mm-hmm. that it's not that plain as inconsistency, then mm-hmm. you might have to say something about the other properties that the two theories together.
Yes, but the main thing is that you don't have so the terms which are used in these theories don't refer to the same entities.
Yeah, they can light part of the phenomena for the other. Mm-hmm. The other theory doesn't have to endorse the full explanation, but. So
there can be, but the main problem is that the tension arises because the same term is used in different ways, and then if you put them together, it seems that you get some inconsistent claims. But if they are to say, okay, we have behavior number 1 and behavior number 2, and we are referring to each other, there is no inconsistency.
Well, it's okay.
Okay, now is related to this discussion, or is another question?
A little bit. I have 2 questions. So one is related. So the GPS system, mm-hmm. You're bringing in theories that are inconsistent with each other in one machine that has one purpose, and it's helpful, mm-hmm. and it works. So why is that? Are those incompatible?
No, the reason why I said that I'm not sure we are dealing with inconsistency here is that I'm not sure about whether in how far Newtonian physics in this sense is really inconsistent, with what is taken from each of these theories, whether scientists would really claim that we have here inconsistency. They would maybe say, from each of these theories we take certain perspectives, but of course we know what we are doing here, and so...
But that shows that they're all compatible with each other,
mm-hmm.
right? So these are all compatible.
Well, they are compatible in the sense that they can be used, but
in one machine.
But sure. But where you will get incompatibility is at the level of conceptual analysis of these theories separately. So the way, for instance, the notion of mass is used in Newton physics, and the way notion of mass is used in relativity theory are different notions, and then you might get some incompatibilities regarding how you don't listen. Yeah. I just want to say one more thing regarding this notion of incompatibility. It's also largely a language philosophical notion, because if we refer to, let's say, causal theories of reference, which think that we can always go to one specific phenomenon and we can have one way of identifying the phenomenon, then we might have an argument that, for instance, there is something like the notion of behavior, which is the right notion of behavior, and then one theory would have this notion. But if we give up from that, and many philosophers give up on this commitment, as many philosophers of science do, and say there is nothing like predetermined way of conceptualizing the world, then we may get very well different notions, and we don't necessarily get incompatibility.
It's related to
exactly that. So this is not my next question. Sorry. Amongst your assumptions of the assumptions at the very beginning, so you had 5 of them. I would add a linguistic assumption, which has not been discussed very explicitly. That our language is adequate.
Yeah, that it can express
That we can
this.
refine
Yeah,
it
yeah, yeah.
up to the point that we need to at any given time,
Mhm,
and that we will all understand the same thing by the same words. Clearly we don't.
That would be a part of
And
this.
that assumption, if you make that explicit, it might help to clarify some of these discussions too. So it's just a friendly
Mhm.
suggestion.
It's a definition taken by this by the pluralists, the longitudinal Calvin voters. They made this assumption, but I think they would agree that in this idea that our theories can reflect the nature of the world, can grasp the nature of the world in a unified way. This assumption about the language has to be present also.
That's right.
It's
Just to
assumed.
disentangle the language issue
Sure,
from
you-
grasping
yeah, yeah.
something else.
Please, Professor Buchelli.
So I really liked the talk, thanks. I have two really minor comments. One is exactly about
Okay.
Hassan, because I think it's a very misleading picture
Okay.
that he's presenting there, right? Because given the kind of way in which the technology functions, you really don't need, quantum mechanics, you don't
Okay.
need special, or even, general relativity
Yes, you do.
to
So you think this is
you run these
or
quantum
this
mechanics
is
just fine.
okay.
Now, the kind of corrections are minimal, right?
No,
Yeah,
you would only find out the Icarus walked in Mexico City if you had Newtonian, if you didn't use relativity theory. That's how accurate
There's a
it is.
continuous divergence because of
oh, yeah,
the.
but, okay, fair enough. If you don't want to do that, do it in one theory, right? You do in relativity, right? So that's it. So it's not that you need the other ones. So
Okay, you think this is an exaggerated picture?
it's a very misleading one.
I don't
Okay.
think so.
Yeah. No, look.
I don't know enough about the
So
this
so
case.
yeah, I don't really see that you are invoking this,
Mhm.
right? So he's in a sort of very rhetorical way suggesting you need.
Yeah.
So, now the other one is also a little quibble about set theory. One of the examples of an inconsistent internal inconsistent mathematical theory.
There was avoidance of inconsistency.
Yeah, that's not the way that set theory was actually developed, right? So,
Okay, so the
and because there is this story that actually Russell
so
invented, that you have, so the Cantor endorsed naive set theory, and given the paradoxes, we need to find some way to fix that, right? And this is not, Cantor never endorsed naive set theory. He actually had a view that every set should be well ordered, which is actually a fairly constrained conception of set.
Okay.
What happened is in 1904, Zermelo actually trying to articulate that view, showed that every set can be well ordered in a paper. Of course, you need to invoke the axiom of choice, and then there is a poor response.
Okay, but your point is that there was never an endorsement of an inconsistent theory because there was a. But my point was just that inconsistency is avoided by a certain conceptual reframing.
Yeah, the point is the development of set theory. Because
Okay.
you're saying, look, there's a conceptual change.
Okay.
And it suggests here that, look, I'm going to develop a theory in order to avoid the paradox.
Okay, but you are saying there was never a theory which didn't have it, which couldn't deal with the paradox.
Well, the theory was invented by Russell,
Okay.
right? That he attributed to
Yeah.
Cantor, naive set theory, which was never endorsed by anyone,
Okay.
right? And the actual development of set theories, or non-Franco set theory, was actually a response in an attempt at articulating Cantor's program.
Okay, but that's enough for what I'm claiming here. That if you look at
Inconsistency played no role whatsoever. In fact, if you read the 1908 paper,
okay.
in which the first axiomatic treatment of set theory is presented by Zermelo, one of the things he says right in the beginning, here are the axioms. Of course, the axiom of choice is one of them. I haven't been able to prove that they are consistent. That's all.
Okay.
So there's no issue about, look, we have all these paradox floating around that we need to fix. This is a terrible misconstrol of the development of set theory.
Okay, but this doesn't mean that as a result the inconsistency was not.
Inconsistency, it was never an issue.
I believe he has something to say. on
Yeah,
that.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe not paradox, but some inconsistency was involved actually for and it was about the pure units of Cantor. Yeah. He couldn't make sense of what pure units could be, and then this was a motivation for developing another conception of set.
But in which papers does that show up?
And
Because
in the collected works of Cantor, the introduction by Sormel says, well, Cantor has this idea of pure units, but pure units have to be need properties, but they don't have properties according to Cantor, and we need a different way of conceptualizing.
but if you look at the actual paper, right, this doesn't show up, right? You get
That's just
mathematics.
one paper, and Sormel had many motivations for developing his own set theory. And one of those motivations was this inconsistency of pure units.
Yeah, well, it's curious that in the paper he actually provides axiomatic treatment for set theory. He doesn't even bother to mention.
Maybe the main motivation was trying to prove or doing something with well orderings, but certainly
Yeah,
there
he was-
was a worry of
No.
inconsistency in Cantor's theory.
Well, the worry was whether you could, how you could prove that every set could be well ordered, because that's what Cantor actually is committed to. Zermelo proved that in 2004. Then people complained. They said, "No, you rely on this principle of choice. What is that? This is unacceptable." People who use the principle deny it. To clean that up in 1908, he axiomatized that theory. Said, "Okay, here's a way in which you can actually get this mass under control." And that's how set theory, Zermelo set theory, came into being. So there was no.
But this seems to be a controversy at the level of historical analysis of what really happened. Because a lot of authors, I only read it in this sense about it.
Well, but it's.
But it's good to know that there is a different
It's
interpretation.
controversial. I mean,
Yeah, that's why.
Livier has this book which is called Understanding the Infinite, where in the beginning he defends these views, but many people don't really agree with that. For example, if you read the work of Kevin Clement, which is a Russell scholar, he has a couple of papers on Russell's development of Cantor's paradox and his paradox, and there's a discussion of the notion of set, and when you have to try when you try to use that notion of set to ground logic, as in the work of Frege and in the work of other logicians and in the algebraic tradition, then you come up with certain difficulties which maybe were not present specifically in Cantor's formulation, but certainly it's not as if there was just this one man who had certain difficulties with the notion. There were many people in different, working in different mathematical traditions at the time who thought there were some difficulties in there, perhaps not specifically Cantor, but so I don't think it's just settled.
Okay. Well,
Can I just one footnote on that? The work on LV mind is actually kind of worries. There's a series of papers on that. Well, actually, I think he really discussed in detail that part of the history. And I think show very clear way that even Levine does not. Right? To what are actually the motivations for the formulation of theory from a mathematical point of view.
Okay.
So at least we need to be careful. I think that's the.
Sure, it's just one example. I can bring any other example.
Yeah.
For me, it's just interesting that there is this conceptual change as a way of getting rid of the inconsistency. But plug in any other example.
well, let's move. You have a question?
It's just follow up from this, actually.
It's okay.
Well, Cantor in some ways was alert to this too, because he has two different kinds of set, right? There are the sets that you can manipulate, and there are the sets that are just like what we would think of as proper classes. They were just huge, and they brought us to God. I mean, they were such almost spiritual things. So he was aware that there was something odd about those things, and you couldn't subject them to normal mathematical manipulation. So that way of interpreting Cantor and being alert to those passages in Cantor would say that even Cantor was alert to these internal inconsistencies in some sense. And he did a nice calling off, right?
So you would say that he also had some kind of conceptual ways of dealing with it.
Right, and that when he first thought about the notion of set was it had both, and then he decided to say, okay, there are two kinds of these things. One of them is the proper classing, and one is the ones that we can subject to mathematical manipulations. And he didn't present a theory in an axiomatic sense either. It was just a sort of set of ideas.
Okay, just
Anyone else?
Just coming back to Chang's quote,
okay.
I was thinking that from a scientific realist point of view, those theories are compatible metaphysically, ontologically. And if you are an instrumentalist, then they are not incompatible. Once you restrict their domains of application from an instrumentalist point of view. So probably Chang is taking the scientific realist attitude or point of view.
Yeah, which was interesting because he is himself not a realist at all in that sense.
Well, but they're incompatible, it seems they're incompatible
But if you...
ontologically.
That's a good remark. It has to do also very much with interpretation of theories. And I agree.
Well, we have time for one more question.
I was still puzzled with the point that Diedrich asked as well, because I had the same reaction to his about the compatibility and inconsistency. Can you try to tell us more about how exactly two things are incompatible without boiling down into becoming inconsistent?
Okay, but it's really a language philosophical problem, because the main thing is that you get, so you have the same pre-analytic notion, behavior, and the same general question, what causes behavior? And now you have different ways of specifying what behavior means. Now, if you specify behavior in these different ways, the question, and if you agree that each of these ways is a legitimate way of specifying behavior, and each of these methods are doing a different thing, you don't get any incompatibilities.
Right.
But if you get tensions at this level of what is the right way to specify this pre-analytic notion, what are the right methods to tackle them, as it's actually happening in scientific practice. So these scientists really are arguing with each other. They don't have a kind of reconciled plurality. It's a very tensional domain. Then you get incompatibilities. So it comes out largely of how this term and how this what causes behavior, really this question how it's interpreted.
That's right, but then you get inconsistencies as well. Right? Because when you talk about tension, what I understand, well, you say that there is this tendency in the population that is X, you have this other tendency inconsistent with it that is not. If both are consistent, then there is no incompatibility.
That's true.
Well, as I understood it, sorry. As I understood it, that there are differences on what is behavior.
Right.
And of course, because no psychologist or the human scientists will accept that all the three things are legitimate objects of research one next to the other. They will say that it's like the discussion about intelligence or all that kind of stuff. So there is, people fill out what behavior is, and I think in that sense, they have disagreements about how to fill it out. But then if you look at the theories, since they talk about different things, there is of course no literal contradiction.
And then there's no tension either, and then there's no incompatibility. That's what I don't understand.
The tension is pragmatic. I mean, you've got ideas about how best to investigate these things, what the best research question to pursue is, what's going to be most illuminating when we'll pursue the question.
So for instance,
there is the rest of the contradiction, that this is the best, this is not the best.
That's right. Either you, that's exactly my word.
It's either methodological, not a content level.
That's okay.
It's really terms of the theories do not conflict with each other.
Exactly, but you get incompatibility at the methodological level, how these scientists are arguing with each other and how they assess each other's theories.
That's fine, but then they have inconsistent views about the methodology.
At the meta level.
They might have inconsistent views, but at the level of scientists, as soon as you get disagreements, you can argue there are some inconsistencies in the field. But if you analyze the works of the scientists, you might not, and you as a now philosopher of science, or let's say some other scientist, interpret this work, you might not find any inconsistencies.
No, but
If you say you guys are talking about different things, so you are not really.
no, that's right. But you go for that, right? 'Cause
Sure, and then you can recognize that there are some inconsistencies. So it really depends. So maybe the notion of incompatibility would capture the disagreements, conflicts, or inconsistencies at the level of the disagreement of the scientific community, while at the analysis of theories you might not find any.
That's right. But that I would suggest don't bring the notion of incompatibility. You're just going to confuse people.
It's
It's a lot-
used by pluralists, isn't it?
And I understand. It's confusing.
Okay.
Right? So I think it's much cleaner. So look, there's a notion of inconsistency. It's just it applies at different levels. And that we understand.
The notion,
Because-
okay,
because what I want-
here is where the notion of incompatibility is useful. If you say that these two different approaches to understanding behavior are incompatible, what you mean is that scientists don't necessarily adopt the other perspective as a legitimate one. So you say it's something more than saying these are different parallel research programs and they are peacefully coexisting.
That's right.
It's a normative disagreement at the maximum.
It is at the moment, yeah, in the field.
We have a point here, or only if there's time. It was a small informative question, and I can also ask it so later on to Dunja. Only if there's time. We can.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, let's have one question.
No, it was an informative question concerning the Peptic Ulcer case. You used it as an example of an inconsistency between theory and observation.
Right.
But, I'm missing some step. Was there really an inconsistency? Because you also mentioned that, well, there was this methodological flaw. So his
Inconsistency was between the results. Let me between. This was between the results which Palmer got, showing there are no bacteria, and the core assumption of the bacterial research program that there must be bacteria.
Yeah, but his result was not reliable.
Yeah, just in the moment when it came out, when nobody knew if it was reliable, then there was an inconsistency in the field. There is this paper published showing there are no bacteria, and there are.
But then you continued that his contemporaries actually could have.
They could, but they didn't.
But they didn't.
Yes.
Okay.
But it's
And it was
yes.
really uphill to get it back in.
Yes, it was
inside
30
the
years.
credibility,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. That's the issue. But it wasn't necessarily an inconsistency if they would have interpreted this.
Do you have a hypothesis why they didn't? They didn't
no, so
know
this is-
about the previous
this
work,
is-
or they?
So it's quite bizarre that Christian and I found out actually that they didn't recognize that actually Parman's results were methodologically wrong. They actually had means of recognizing they were wrong at the time. So far the received view is that actually Palmer did everything according to the book. There was no problem. But now, since we know that he could have done something, this is a more sociological question. Why nobody did anything? One answer is that just people switched to other research questions. There were these antacids which could deal with the problem of the ulcer, and so this relapse, the problem was just relapse of ulcer, but it was not such a big issue. Another thing was that there were other research avenues, like cancer was a big research project back then. Or maybe there were some other sociological factors which we are missing now. So this is something to look into.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
So we are going for a lunch break, and we come back at 3 p.m.
There's also the fact that this is not a